The mission briefing happened in a tent outside King Fahd International Airport, and if you'd walked in without context, you would have assumed someone was pranking the Army. 8 Apache helicopters, Army helicopters, were being tasked to open an Air Force war. Not support it, not assist, open it. As in, if Task Force Normandy failed, the entire Desert Storm air campaign would have to be delayed, or rerouted, or maybe just canceled, because 2,000 coalition aircraft depended on 2 Iraqi radar sites dying at exactly the same moment. The Air Force had stealth fighters. They had cruise missiles. They had electronic warfare aircraft specifically designed to suppress enemy air defenses. But none of those platforms could guarantee what Central Command needed, which was surgical destruction of 2 targets 70 miles apart within a 30-second window at 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991. So they gave it to the Apaches. Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cody commanded Task Force Normandy, and the plan he received was the kind of operational absurdity that only makes sense if you're absolutely certain it'll work. 2 Iraqi early warning radar stations, codenamed objectives Nebraska and Oklahoma, sat in the western desert providing overlapping coverage of the approaches to Baghdad. Kill one and the other immediately radios the capital. Kill both simultaneously, and you create a 17-minute radar gap wide enough to fly the entire coalition air armada through undetected. The problem was distance. The 2 sites were far enough apart that a single Apache team couldn't service both targets. So Task Force Normandy split into 2 teams, red and white, each assigned 4 Apaches. Red team would hit objective Nebraska. White team would hit Oklahoma. And both teams would fire their opening salvos within seconds of each other, despite being separated by terrain that made visual coordination impossible. I don't know what Cody thought when he first saw the mission parameters, but I know what the Apaches were up against. The AH-64 had a combat radius of about 150 miles in perfect conditions. This mission required penetrating 50 miles into Iraq, loitering long enough to positively identify targets in total darkness, executing a synchronized attack with another team you couldn't see or communicate with directly, and then flying home with enough fuel reserve to reach friendly territory if something went wrong. Oh, and the navigation system was GPS, which in 1991 meant experimental satellite technology that worked great in testing and was absolutely unproven in combat over featureless desert at night. The Air Force provided 2 MH-53 Pave-Low helicopters as pathfinders. The Pave-Lows had better navigation systems and would lead the Apaches to the target area. But the actual attack? That was all Apache. The Hellfire missiles, the 30mm chain guns, the target acquisition systems, the coordination. Army equipment flown by Army pilots executing an Air Force mission because nobody else could do it. Task Force Normandy launched from Al Juf around 1 a.m. 8 Apaches, 2 Pave-Lows, flying in complete radio silence across the Saudi-Iraqi border. The Pave-Lows dropped chem-light markers at the border to confirm the crossing point, then led the formation north into Iraqi airspace at 50 feet above ground level. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, 2 Iraqi radar installations continued their routine scans, completely unaware that 8 American helicopters were about to rewrite the definition of surgical strike. The AH-64 Apache was not supposed to be the hero of Desert Storm. It was supposed to be a budget line item that Congress could point to as evidence of Pentagon waste. The program ran over budget, behind schedule, and faced cancellation multiple times during the 1980s. Critics called it too complex, too expensive, too specialized for actual combat. The Army had dumped billions into a helicopter designed to hunt Soviet tanks in Central Europe, and now the Cold War was ending, and everyone wanted to know what they'd gotten for their money. What they'd gotten was the only rotary wing aircraft on Earth capable of flying 50 miles into enemy territory at night, identifying targets with thermal imaging, and prosecuting those targets with precision-guided missiles, all while remaining undetected by ground-based radar. The Apache's TAD/PNVS system, target acquisition and designation sight paired with pilot night vision sensor, gave crews the ability to see in complete darkness using forward-looking infrared, not night vision goggles that amplified ambient light. Actual thermal imaging that detected heat signatures through dust, smoke, and total blackness. Iraqi radar operators working the night shift at objectives Nebraska and Oklahoma showed up as glowing human-shaped blobs on Apache targeting screens from 3 miles away. The Hellfire missile was equally ridiculous. Laser-guided fire-and-forget capability, designed to punch through Soviet tank armor. Each Apache carried 16 of them. The original plan had the Apaches using unguided rockets for the initial barrage, but someone, I'm not sure who, decided that unguided munitions introduced too much variability. Task Force Normandy would use Hellfires exclusively. Overkill for thin-skinned radar installations. But overkill was the entire point. Here's what makes the Apache selection stranger. The AH-64 was loud. Helicopter loud. The Pavlos leading the formation were even louder. This wasn't a stealth mission in the traditional sense. Task Force Normandy was betting that Iraqi air defenses were looking up, not out, and that flying at 50 feet would keep them below radar horizon long enough to achieve complete surprise. And it worked, because Iraqi air defense doctrine was Soviet doctrine, which meant big picture thinking. Defend against mass bomber formations. Defend against high-altitude penetrators. Defend against cruise missiles. The concept of helicopters flying terrain-following profiles across open desert to kill strategic targets wasn't even considered a realistic threat. Helicopters were tactical assets. They supported ground operations. They didn't open strategic bombing campaigns. The Apaches also carried 1,200 rounds of 30mm ammunition. The M230 chain gun fired at 625 rounds per minute and was designed to shred light armor at ranges where return fire couldn't reach. Task Force Normandy pilots knew they'd use Hellfires for the first shots. Precision kills on radar dishes, generator buildings, command bunkers. But after the opening salvo, anything still moving or transmitting would get the gun. I think about the congressional hearings from the mid-1980s sometimes. Politicians demanding justification for Apache procurement costs. Defense analysts questioning whether the Army needed such an expensive tank killer. And less than 5 years later, those same helicopters are the linchpin of the largest air offensive since World War II. Task Force Normandy didn't prove the Apache was cost-effective. It proved that building weapon systems for worst-case scenarios means you have overwhelming advantages when you actually use them. The Iraqis were defending against the threats they understood. The Americans showed up with capabilities that didn't fit any existing threat model. The synchronization problem was simple to understand and nearly impossible to solve. Objectives Nebraska and Oklahoma were 70 miles apart. Both had overlapping radar coverage. If Red Team killed Nebraska first, Iraqi operators at Oklahoma would immediately detect the loss of radar contact and alert Baghdad. If White Team killed Oklahoma first, Nebraska would do the same. The only solution was simultaneous destruction, which meant 2 teams of Apache helicopters had to coordinate their attacks across a distance that made direct visual or radio contact impossible, while maintaining total emissions control to avoid detection. Central Command gave Task Force Normandy a 30-second window. That's it. Both radar sites had to go dark within 30 seconds of each other, or the entire mission failed, and 2,000 coalition aircraft would be flying into alerted air defenses at dawn. Dick Cody's solution was brutally straightforward: synchronized watches and a pre-briefed time hack. Both teams would attack at exactly 2:38 a.m. local time. No radio calls, no flares, no confirmation signals, Just two teams trusting that the other team was doing their job 70 miles away in the darkness. And if your Apache malfunctioned, if your navigation system failed, if you got lost in the featureless desert and couldn't find the target, you still attacked at 2:38 a.m. Even if it meant firing Hellfires at empty sand, you fired at 2:38 because the other team was counting on Iraqi operators hearing explosions at both sites simultaneously. The mission planning included backup options that weren't really backups. If one team failed to destroy their target, the other team was supposed to egress immediately and hope that coalition air defenses could compensate. But everyone knew what that meant. Alerting Iraqi air defenses even 5 minutes early would give them time to scramble interceptors, activate backup radar systems, and reposition SAM batteries. American casualties would spike. I find it darkly funny that the entire Desert Storm air campaign, the technological showcase of stealth fighters and precision-guided munitions and network-centric warfare, depended on 8 helicopters hitting their marks based on wristwatches. The Apaches didn't carry backup communication systems for coordination between teams. They maintained strict radio silence from the moment they crossed the Saudi border. Red Team had no way of knowing if White Team was even still flying. White Team had no confirmation that Red Team hadn't aborted. Both teams just pressed north into Iraqi airspace, trusting that everyone would execute on time. Objectives Nebraska and Oklahoma were chosen specifically because they provided early warning coverage for the western approaches to Baghdad. Destroying them created a radar gap roughly 20 miles wide. Not huge, but enough for strike packages to penetrate at low altitude before Iraqi operators realized their coverage had holes. The gap would only last 17 minutes before backup systems and mobile radars repositioned to fill the void. 17 minutes for the entire coalition air armada to cross the border undetected. That timeline didn't include any margin for error. If Task Force Normandy attacked late, the window closed. If they attacked early and failed to achieve complete destruction, Iraqi operators would have time to transmit warnings before the main strike packages arrived. The mission required perfect execution from pilots flying experimental navigation systems over terrain they'd never seen at night, with zero ability to coordinate in real time. The Air Force had been planning Desert Storm's opening strikes for months. They had target lists and route packages and bomb damage assessments. But all of it hinged on 2 radar sites dying at 2:38 a.m. And 8 Army helicopters were the only asset capable of making that happen. The Apaches flew north at 50 feet using GPS receivers that were so new the military designation was still experimental. This was 1991. The GPS constellation wasn't even complete yet. The system worked mostly, but it had never been combat tested in conditions like this. Featureless desert, no visual landmarks, total darkness, flying formation with other aircraft while maintaining terrain-following altitude. The paved lows led the way because their inertial navigation systems were more reliable, but even those had drift rates that required constant correction. The formation flew in complete blackout. No exterior lights, no communication except hand signals between pilots that nobody could actually see. Just the dull glow of cockpit instruments and the thermal imagery showing endless flat deserts scrolling past at 120 knots. Nobody had practiced this specific profile. Task Force Normandy rehearsed the attack sequence and target identification, but they'd never flown the actual penetration route. Saudi Arabia doesn't look like Iraq. The terrain features they'd studied in reconnaissance photos weren't visible from 50 feet in darkness. The Apaches were navigating by GPS coordinates to an objective they'd only seen in satellite images. And the formation had to stay tight. Spread out too much, and you risk losing visual contact with the paved lows. Bunch up too close, and rotor wash from the lead aircraft makes the trail aircraft unflyable. The pilots were threading a margin that left zero room for error while flying instruments in an aircraft that was designed for nap-of-the-earth combat, not long-range navigation. I think the fuel situation bothered them more than the Iraqis did. The AH-64 burns about 140 gallons per hour in cruise. Task Force Normandy's flight plan included 50 miles penetration, a loiter period for target acquisition, the actual attack, and 50 miles back to friendly territory. That's cutting it close, even with full internal tanks and no combat damage. Lose a fuel line to ground fire, and you're walking home. At some point during the flight north, the two teams split. Red team peeled off toward objective Nebraska. White team continued toward Oklahoma. No radio call, no acknowledgement, just 4 Apaches breaking formation in the darkness and disappearing from view. And now each team was completely alone. No backup, no support. No way to know if the other team was still on schedule, or if they'd encountered problems, or if their GPS had failed and they were currently lost somewhere in the Iraqi desert. The western desert is flat in the way that makes navigation psychological torture. No hills, no rivers, no roads, just endless gravel plains that look identical in every direction. The Apaches had trained for European terrain, forests and villages and ridgelines. This was flying by instruments and faith that the GPS waypoints were accurate. Red team spotted objective Nebraska first. Thermal imaging picked up the heat signatures of generator buildings and radar dishes from 3 miles out. The site matched reconnaissance photos. 4 Apaches spread into attack formation and began designating targets with their laser systems. White team found objective Oklahoma minutes later. Same setup. Generator buildings, radar dishes, command bunkers. Everything right where intelligence said it would be. Both teams held position. 3 miles out, just beyond visual range from the Iraqi operators who were currently staring at radar screens showing absolutely nothing unusual. The Apaches stayed low, stayed quiet, and waited for their watches to hit 2:38 a.m. 70 miles apart, 16 pilots checked their weapon systems one final time and counted down the seconds to an attack that would either open Desert Storm or strand 2,000 coalition aircraft on the wrong side of alerted air defenses. At 2:38 a.m., 16 Apaches fired simultaneously. The Hellfires left the rails with that characteristic whoosh, barely audible over rotor noise but unmistakable to anyone who's heard one. Laser designators held steady on radar dishes, generator buildings, and command bunkers. The missiles covered 3 miles in seconds, tracking their laser spots with precision that made unguided rockets look like throwing rocks. The first wave hit before Iraqi operators understood they were under attack. Radar dishes exploded into shrapnel. Generator buildings erupted in secondary explosions as fuel tanks cooked off. Command bunkers, thin-skinned structures never designed to withstand anti-armor missiles, collapsed into rubble. The Hellfires kept coming, 27 total between both sites and the opening salvo alone. Iraqi air defense doctrine assumed attacks would come from altitude. Surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, everything pointed up. The radar operators at Nebraska and Oklahoma were scanning for high-altitude bombers and cruise missiles. They never looked at the desert floor where 8 helicopters were hovering at 50 feet, pumping precision-guided missiles into their installations. The Apaches didn't stop after the Hellfires. Anything still standing got the 30-millimeter chain gun. The M230 shredded antenna arrays, communication buildings, vehicle parks. Tracers arced across the desert in streams that looked almost lazy until you realized each round was moving at 2,600 feet per second and designed to penetrate light armor. I don't know if the Iraqi crews tried to transmit warnings. Some probably did. But the Hellfires hit the communication buildings first. Not by accident, by design. Task Force Normandy knew exactly which structures housed the radio equipment and which held the radar systems. Target priority was communications first, radar second, everything else third. The attack lasted maybe 4 minutes. Could have been less. After the Hellfires expended and the chain guns went quiet, both objectives were completely dark. No radar emissions, no radio traffic, no lights except fires burning in destroyed buildings. Red team egressed immediately. White team did the same. No battle damage assessment. No confirmation that targets were destroyed. The mission brief was clear. Hit your targets at 2:38, break contact, get out. Coalition intelligence would confirm destruction later through other means. The Apaches turned south and ran for the Saudi border at full speed. Fuel gauges were dropping. Navigation systems showed the waypoints, but desert at night from 50 feet all looks the same. The PAVE lows had already egressed ahead of the attack. Their job was pathfinding, not loitering over hostile territory. Task Force Normandy crossed back into Saudi airspace around 3:15 a.m. Total mission time, roughly 2 hours. 0 aircraft lost, 0 casualties. And behind them, a 20-mile gap in Iraqi radar coverage that stayed open for exactly the 17 minutes Central Command needed. The first wave of coalition strike aircraft crossed the Iraqi border at 2:51 a.m., 13 minutes after Task Force Normandy's attack. F-117 stealth fighters headed for Baghdad. F-15E Strike Eagles targeting airfields. Navy Tomahawks inbound from the Persian Gulf. All of them flying through airspace that should have been swarming with alerted interceptors and SAM systems. But Iraqi Air Defense Headquarters in Baghdad saw nothing. Their early warning radar at objectives Nebraska and Oklahoma was gone. The backup systems hadn't repositioned yet. For 17 minutes, the western approaches to Iraq were effectively blind. Coalition air controllers didn't confirm Task Force Normandy's success until the strike packages reported 0 ground fire crossing the border. That was the first indication that the radar sites were actually dead. 2 Apache teams, 70 miles apart, had executed synchronized attacks with such precision that Iraqi air defenses never realized they'd been hit until American aircraft were already over Baghdad. The Iraqis detected nothing. Not the Apaches, not the PAVE lows, not the Hellfire missiles until they were already impacting. Iraqi air defense operators at Nebraska and Oklahoma were working routine night shifts scanning for threats that matched Soviet doctrine. High-altitude bombers, cruise missiles, fighter bombers at medium altitude. Their radar systems were looking up and out, not down at the desert floor. The AH-64 has a radar cross-section small enough that ground-based early warning systems struggle to distinguish it from terrain clutter at low altitude. Flying at 50 feet, the Apaches were below the radar horizon for most Iraqi systems. The radar waves literally passed over them. Even if an operator had been specifically scanning for low-altitude threats, helicopters moving at 120 knots blend into ground returns unless you know exactly what you're looking for. The PAVE lows were louder and bigger, but followed the same principle. Stay low. Stay in the radar shadow. Exploit the fact that Soviet-designed air defense networks prioritized high-altitude threats over terrain-hugging aircraft. It's not that Iraqi operators were incompetent. They were looking for the threats they'd been trained to counter. Helicopters penetrating 50 miles into Iraqi territory to strike strategic targets wasn't in the playbook. Iraqi doctrine also assumed they'd have warning time. Early detection meant time to vector interceptors, time to activate backup radar systems, time to alert command headquarters. But Task Force Normandy compressed the decision loop to 0. From first missile impact to complete radar blackout took maybe 90 seconds. There was no decision to make because by the time Iraqi operators realized they were under attack, their equipment was already destroyed. I sometimes wonder what those radar operators thought in the seconds between the first explosion and the communication systems going dead. Did they assume it was an accident? A vehicle fire? Artillery from some unknown border skirmish? The idea that American helicopters were hovering 3 miles away, systematically destroying their installation, probably seemed impossible. The Hellfires didn't give warnings. No radar lock tone, no incoming missile alert. just impacts that turned radar dishes into scrap metal before anyone could process what was happening. By the time the chain guns opened up, both sites were already combat ineffective. Iraqi Air Defense Headquarters in Baghdad received no warnings from Nebraska or Oklahoma. The installations just went silent. Standard procedure would be attempting to re-establish contact, checking for equipment malfunction, maybe dispatching a repair crew. But all of that takes time, and while Baghdad was trying to figure out why 2 radar sites suddenly stopped transmitting, coalition aircraft were already crossing the border in their radar shadow. The 17-minute window was calculated based on how long Iraqi air defenses would need to recognize the gap, reposition mobile radar units, and restore coverage. It wasn't random. American intelligence had studied Iraqi response times and command structures for months. They knew exactly how long Task Force Normandy needed to buy, and the Iraqis never saw it coming because they were defending against Cold War threats using Cold War doctrine. Massed bomber formations, high-altitude penetrators, strategic cruise missile strikes. The threat model didn't include precision helicopter raids against point targets deep in defended territory. The Americans had spent decades preparing for World War III in Central Europe. They'd built weapons and tactics designed to counter Soviet air defenses that were exponentially more sophisticated than anything Iraq possessed. The Apaches were designed to hunt T-72 tanks through German forests while dodging ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft systems and SA-6 missiles. Iraqi radar installations in open desert were a training exercise by comparison. Task Force Normandy exploited every advantage: technological superiority, doctrinal flexibility, and Iraqi assumptions about what American forces could or would attempt. The Iraqis were waiting for an air war. The Americans opened it with helicopters. The 17-minute window wasn't generous. It was the absolute minimum time required for the first wave of coalition strike packages to penetrate Iraqi airspace and reach their targets before backup radar systems could compensate for the loss of Nebraska and Oklahoma. Every aircraft crossing the border during that window depended on those radar sites staying dead long enough to avoid early detection. F-117 stealth fighters went in first. They were headed for Baghdad. Command bunkers, communication centers, air defense headquarters. The F-117s had stealth on their side, but stealth isn't invisibility. It's reduced radar cross-section, which means delayed detection. Give Iraqi operators enough time and the right angle, and even a stealth fighter shows up. But with the Western radar coverage gone, the F-117S penetrated undetected until they were already over their targets. F-15E Strike Eagles followed. They were hitting airfields and SAM sites across western Iraq. The Strike Eagles were fast, but not stealthy. Flying through alerted air defenses would have meant running a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles and interceptors. But Task Force Normandy's raid gave them a blind spot to exploit. They crossed the border, dropped their ordnance, and egressed before Iraqi air defense could reorient. Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles were also inbound during this window. Tomahawks fly low and slow, relatively speaking. Easy targets if you see them coming. But the missiles used the radar gap to penetrate deep into Iraqi airspace before mobile SAM systems could acquire and engage them. By the time Iraqi operators realized Tomahawks were inbound, the missiles were already hitting targets in Baghdad. The entire air campaign's opening phase hinged on those 17 minutes. Central Command had synchronized every strike package, every missile launch, every bomber wave to exploit the window that 8 Apaches created. If Task Force Normandy had failed, the timetable collapses. Aircraft get rerouted. Missions get delayed. Casualties spike because now you're flying into alerted defenses instead of catching them blind. Iraqi mobile radar units eventually filled the gap. They repositioned from other sectors and restored coverage over the western approaches. But by then it didn't matter. The critical first strikes were already complete. Baghdad was under attack, airfields were cratered, air defense nodes were destroyed. The initiative belonged entirely to coalition forces. I think about the risk calculation sometimes. Task Force Normandy was 8 helicopters with 16 crew. If the mission failed, if the Apaches got lost, if GPS malfunctioned, if Iraqi air defenses got lucky, the operational consequences rippled across the entire war plan. But the alternative was worse. Launching Desert Storm without clearing those radar sites meant accepting casualties from alerted air defenses, or delaying the air campaign while planners figured out another solution. So Central Command bet everything on experimental GPS navigation, untested coordination protocols, and the assumption that Iraqi operators wouldn't detect helicopters flying at 50 feet through empty desert at 2:30 in the morning. And it worked. The 17-minute window wasn't just about timing. It was about American confidence that they'd built systems and trained personnel capable of executing missions this surgically precise. The Soviets never developed helicopter doctrine for strategic strikes. They used helicopters tactically, close air support, anti-armor, reconnaissance. The idea of using rotary wing aircraft to open a theater-wide air campaign was fundamentally American thinking. Task Force Normandy gave coalition air forces total surprise for those critical first minutes. By the time Iraqi air defenses understood the scope of the attack, American aircraft were already over Baghdad dropping bombs. The war's opening moves happened in the time it took Iraq to realize it was under attack. 17 minutes. 2 radar sites. 8 helicopters. And the entire Desert Storm air campaign flew through the gap they created. Task Force Normandy wasn't the biggest engagement of Desert Storm. It didn't involve the most aircraft or produce the highest casualty counts or generate dramatic gun camera footage that played on CNN. 8 helicopters killing 2 radar installations doesn't sound impressive compared to the thunder runs into Baghdad, or the Highway of Death, or the 100-hour ground war. But it defines Desert Storm more completely than any other single action, because it proved something the Soviets never believed and the Iraqis never prepared for. America had spent the Cold War building weapons for scenarios that seemed paranoid. The Apache was designed to hunt Soviet tanks in a European war that never happened. GPS was developed for strategic bombers and ballistic missile submarines in a nuclear exchange nobody wanted. Precision-guided munitions, thermal imaging, network-centric coordination, all of it built for World War III. And then Desert Storm happened, and suddenly all those over-engineered, over-budget, too complex for actual combat systems turned out to be devastating against an adversary using Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine. The Iraqis had T-72 tanks, MiG fighters, SA-6 missiles, early warning radar, the same gear the Soviets would have used in Central Europe. But they didn't have the training, the coordination, or the institutional paranoia that came from spending 40 years preparing to fight NATO. Task Force Normandy was proof that American military thinking had evolved beyond anything the Soviet model could counter. Using helicopters for strategic strikes, trusting experimental navigation systems for deep penetration missions, executing synchronized attacks across distances that made real-time coordination impossible. The Soviets would have masked their helicopters for tactical support and called it doctrine. The Americans sent 8 of them to open a war. The mission also exposed the gap between having Soviet equipment and understanding how to use it. Iraqi radar operators had functional systems, proper training, and established procedures. But their doctrine was defensive and reactive. They were waiting to detect threats, not anticipating that threats might already be inside their detection envelope flying at altitudes their radar couldn't effectively cover. I think Desert Storm terrified Soviet military planners more than it hurt the Iraqis. Iraq lost. That was inevitable once coalition forces deployed. But the manner of the loss, the speed, the precision, the technological overmatch, that was the lesson. Soviet equipment performed exactly as designed. The problem was American equipment performed better, and American doctrine exploited gaps Soviet thinking never considered. Task Force Normandy lasted 4 minutes of actual combat. The planning, training, and technological development that made those 4 minutes possible took decades. The AH-64 program started in the 1970s. GPS development began in the 1960s. Hellfire missiles were fielded in the early 1980s. Everything came together in the western Iraqi desert at 2:38 a.m. because the United States had spent 40 years preparing for threats that turned out to be less capable than expected. And that's why this mission matters. Not because it was dramatic or costly or involved massive forces. Because it proved that building weapon systems for worst-case scenarios means you dominate when you actually fight. The Apaches were over-engineered for Iraqi radar sites. The mission was over-planned for an enemy that never detected